I only have $3, but she looks hungrier than me. The words barely left Jaden Brooks' lips as the cold evening wind slipped through the gaps in his worn hoodie, his fingers tightening around the crumpled bills like they might disappear if he blinked. The smell of grilled cheese and hot soup drifting from the small diner window behind him, warm light spilling onto the cracked sidewalk where he stood, stomach aching, eyes fixed on the menu he had memorized without ever truly affording, until a quiet shuffling sound pulled his attention to the bench beside the door where an elderly woman sat wrapped in a thin gray coat, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at nothing in particular, not begging, not asking, just waiting, and something about the stillness in her eyes made Jaden pause in a way hunger never had before. He stepped closer, hesitant at first, like crossing an invisible line between surviving and choosing. Then slowly, almost carefully, he walked inside. The bell above the door chiming softly as heads turned for a second before losing interest, the cashier barely glancing at him as he pointed to the cheapest combo on the board, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. And when the tray slid across the counter, heat rising from the bowl, he held it for a moment longer than necessary, as if saying goodbye to something he hadn't even had yet, before turning back toward the door, the cold hitting him again as he stepped outside, the city humming low around him. And without a word, he walked straight to the woman and gently held out the tray. "You should eat," he said, voice quiet but firm, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The woman looked up slowly, confusion flickering into something deeper as her eyes met his, searching, almost recognizing. "What about you?" she asked, her voice thin but steady, and Jaden just shrugged, offering a small smile that didn't quite hide the hunger in his eyes. "I'll be okay," he said, though even he didn't know if that was true. The woman hesitated, then reached out, her hands brushing his for just a second, and in that moment something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had changed direction. She studied his face with an intensity that didn't match the moment, then leaned in slightly and whispered, "You just did something bigger than you understand." Her words soft but precise, and before he could respond, she reached into her coat and pressed something small into his palm, closing his fingers around it gently, almost deliberately, and then she began to eat, slowly, gratefully, as if each bite carried more than just food, while Jaden stood there for a second longer, confused but strangely warm despite the cold, before turning and walking away, his empty stomach forgotten for reasons he couldn't explain, the small object still resting in his hand. And somewhere across the city, far beyond the dim streetlights and cracked sidewalks, a phone rang inside a glass-walled office high above the skyline. A man freezing mid-step as a voice on the other end said words he hadn't heard in years, and everything in his world suddenly began to move. Jaden did not open his hand until he reached the corner of his block, where the streetlight flickered softly above him and the noise of traffic faded into a distant hum, his fingers slowly uncurling as if whatever rested inside might vanish if exposed too quickly. And when he finally looked down, he saw a small silver ring, worn but polished, with an engraving so faint he had to tilt it toward the light to read it. The letters delicate and old, W.C. He frowned, turning it over in his palm, unsure why something so simple suddenly felt so heavy, like it carried a story he had not been told yet. Then he slipped it carefully into his pocket, not because he understood its value, but because something inside him said it mattered, the same quiet instinct that made him give away his meal. And by the time he reached the narrow apartment building where he lived, the cold had settled deeper into his bones, but his chest felt strangely warm, his grandmother's old heater rattling faintly as he stepped inside, the air thin but familiar. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake her, placing his shoes by the door and sitting on the edge of the worn couch, his stomach reminding him of what he had given up, a dull ache that came in waves. But instead of regret, there was only a lingering thought of the woman's eyes, the way she had looked at him like he was something more than just a kid trying to get by. And he leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the night stretched on, the ring now resting on the table beside him, catching the faint glow of the lamp like it was waiting for something. Somewhere across the city, far from cracked sidewalks and flickering lights, a man stood in silence inside a room of glass and steel, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window as the phone slipped slowly from his hand. the words still echoing in his mind. She has been found. His breath unsteady as memories long buried began to surface, a voice, a laugh, a promise he had not been able to keep, and without another word, he turned, already reaching for his coat, the city lights below blurring as his world shifted in a way he could not control. Back in the apartment, Jaden eventually drifted into a restless sleep, his body curled slightly against the cold, the kind of sleep that comes when exhaustion wins over hunger, and sometime before morning. The faint sound of engines rolling into the neighborhood broke the quiet, low and unfamiliar, headlights sweeping across brick walls and broken pavement, neighbors peeking through curtains as sleek black vehicles lined the street one by one, their presence out of place, almost unreal, until the engines stilled and doors opened in unison, footsteps measured and deliberate against the pavement. And as the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, a tall man stepped out, adjusting his coat as his eyes scanned the worn buildings, searching, focused, until they settled on one door, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, as if standing on the edge of something far greater than himself, before finally walking forward and raising his hand to knock. The knock echoed through the small apartment like something out of a dream, sharp but controlled, not rushed, not impatient, just certain, and Jaden stirred on the couch, his eyes opening slowly as the unfamiliar sound pulled him from sleep. For a moment he did not move, his mind still caught somewhere between the warmth of a dream and the chill of the morning air. Then it came again, 3 steady knocks that seemed to carry weight beyond the thin wooden door, and from the bedroom, his grandmother's voice called out softly, "Jaden, baby, can you see who that is?" He pushed himself up, rubbing his eyes, the events of yesterday still lingering faintly in his chest, though he could not yet explain why. And as his feet touched the cold floor, he hesitated, glancing briefly at the small table where the silver ring still rested, catching the early light, before he walked toward the door, each step slow, cautious, as if something inside him already knew this moment mattered, his hand hovering over the handle for just a second before he finally turned it and pulled the door open. And the world outside did not look like his world anymore. The narrow street filled with polished black vehicles, their surfaces reflecting the morning sun like mirrors, neighbors standing at their windows or just outside their doors, whispering, watching, trying to make sense of what did not belong. And standing directly in front of him was a man who seemed carved from a different life entirely, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored coat that fit him perfectly, his presence quiet but undeniable. His eyes locking onto Jaden's with a focus so intense it made the boy forget the cold entirely. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, heavy with something unspoken, until the man finally exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry years behind it, and said softly, "Are you Jaden Brooks?" His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something unsteady, like he was holding back more than just words. Jaden nodded slowly, his fingers curling slightly against the doorframe, unsure whether to step back or stand his ground, and the man's gaze dropped for just a moment, noticing the worn edges of the doorway, the small space behind it, before returning to Jaden's face, softer now, almost searching. "My name is William Carter," he continued, the name meaning nothing to Jaden, but the way he said it made it feel important. "I believe you met someone yesterday," he added, and at that, something in Jaden shifted, a memory clicking into place, the bench, the quiet woman, the way she had looked at him, and without thinking, his hand moved toward his pocket, then paused, unsure, while William watched closely, as if every small movement mattered. "She told me about you," William said, his voice lower now, more personal, "about what you did." And for the first time, his composure cracked just slightly, his eyes flickering with something that looked a lot like emotion he was not used to showing. "May I come in?" he asked, not as a command, but as a request, and Jaden hesitated, glancing back toward the apartment, toward the life he knew, small and simple, before looking back at the man who clearly came from something much larger, and after a moment, he stepped aside, opening the door just enough, as if allowing more than just a person to enter, and as William crossed the threshold, his gaze fell immediately to the table, to the silver ring resting there, and he stopped, completely still, as if the entire world had just narrowed to that one small object, his breath catching almost imperceptibly, and in that silence, everything began to change. William did not move for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ring as if it had pulled him out of time itself, the room around him fading into something distant and quiet. And when he finally stepped closer, it was slow, almost careful, like he was approaching something fragile, his hand hovering just above the table before he gently picked it up, turning it between his fingers, the faint engraving catching the light. WC. His initials, but not just that, not just a piece of metal, his breath. Unsteady now as memories surfaced without permission, moments he had locked away behind meetings and numbers and years of distance. And behind him, Jaden stood still, watching, unsure what he had done or why this mattered so much. While from the bedroom, his grandmother appeared quietly, her robe wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes moving from the stranger to the cars outside and back again. Confusion settling into cautious concern. "Jaden, who is this?" she asked softly, but William spoke before the boy could answer, his voice lower now, almost reverent. "My name is William Carter, ma'am," he said, turning slightly toward her, though his attention kept drifting back to the ring. "I believe your grandson met my mother yesterday." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy, and Jaden felt something shift again, the memory sharpening. The woman on the bench, the way she had looked at him, the way she had spoken. "She gave me that," he said quietly, nodding toward the ring, and William's gaze lifted immediately, locking onto him. With a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, something like gratitude he did not yet know how to express. "Yes," William replied, his voice almost breaking before he steadied it. "She would have," he added, more to himself than to anyone else. And for a moment, the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater and the distant murmur of neighbors outside. "She disappeared 3 days ago," William continued, finally looking fully at Jaden now. "We searched everywhere, hospitals, shelters, every street she used to walk, but we could not find her." His words were controlled, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. "Until last night," he said, and his grip on the ring tightened slightly. "She was brought home safely," he added, and there was relief there, but also something else, something unresolved. "And the first thing she said when she woke up was about a boy," he went on, his eyes softening as they rested on Jaden again. "A boy who gave her his only meal." Jaden shifted slightly, uncomfortable under the attention, not because he regretted what he had done, but because it had never felt like something important, just something right. And William seemed to notice that, his expression changing, less distant now, more human. "She told me you did not ask for anything," he said quietly. "Not even her name." Jaden shook his head, his voice simple. "She looked like she needed it," he replied, and that answer landed in the room with more force than anything else. William exhaling slowly as if something inside him had finally settled into place, and he glanced around the small apartment again, taking in the worn couch, the quiet space, the life that existed here without recognition or reward. And then he looked back at Jaden, a different kind of determination forming in his eyes, not the kind that built companies or closed deals, but something far more personal. "There is something you need to understand," William said, his voice steady. Now, though still carrying that quiet emotion beneath it. "What you did yesterday, it mattered more than you can imagine." And as he spoke, the distance between their worlds seemed to narrow, just slightly, enough for something new to begin. Jaden did not know what to say after that, the words sitting somewhere between his chest and his throat, but never quite finding their way out, because to him it had not been something important. It had just been a moment, a choice, something small that felt obvious at the time. And yet the way William stood there, holding that ring like it carried the weight of years, made it feel like something else entirely, something bigger than he could understand. His grandmother stepped closer now, her hand resting gently on Jaden's shoulder as she studied William more carefully, not with fear, but with the quiet instinct of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize when something real was unfolding. "She must be very special to you," she said softly, and William nodded without hesitation, his gaze lowering briefly to the ring again before he answered. "She is the reason I became anything at all," he said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, something rooted in memory. "When I was younger, we did not have much either," he continued, glancing around the apartment with a new kind of understanding. But she never let me feel like I had nothing. His eyes lifted again, meeting Jaden's. Yesterday, you did the same for her. And that sentence seemed to settle into the room like a quiet truth. Jaden shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to ignore the feeling that something important was being said. I just gave her food, he replied, his voice simple, almost unsure, and William shook his head gently, a faint smile forming, not one of politeness, but one of recognition. No, he said, you gave her dignity. The word hung there, unfamiliar in this space, but somehow fitting perfectly, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence filled with meaning rather than emptiness. Outside, the faint murmur of the neighborhood continued, curious eyes still watching. But inside, the world felt smaller, more focused. She asked me to find you, William added after a pause, his tone shifting slightly. More intentional now, not to reward you, he clarified, as if that thought had already crossed their minds. But to make sure I understood what you did, he stepped a little closer, not imposing, but present. Because she said something I have not heard in a long time. His voice softened again. She said that kindness still lives where people least expect it. Jaden looked down briefly, his fingers brushing against the edge of his sleeve, unsure how to carry words like that, and his grandmother squeezed his shoulder gently, pride flickering quietly in her eyes. William took a slow breath, then reached into his coat pocket, not pulling out money or anything that glittered, but something far simpler, a small card, which he placed carefully on the table beside the ring, not pushing it forward, not making it the center of the moment, just leaving it there. I would like to help, he said, his voice calm, but firm in a way that suggested. This was not an offer made lightly. But more than that, I would like to learn from you. And that was the moment something shifted again, not just for Jaden, but for William himself, because for the first time in a very long time, he was not standing in front of someone he could change with money or power, but someone who had already changed him without either. And as the morning light grew stronger through the window, it illuminated the small apartment in a way that made it feel different. Not bigger, not richer, but seen, truly seen. And in that quiet space, a new kind of story began to take shape. Jaden stared at the small card on the table as if it might suddenly explain everything. The clean edges and simple design so different from anything in their home that it almost did not belong there. And yet William had placed it beside the ring as if the two were somehow connected, as if one could not be understood without the other, his grandmother gently guiding him to sit down while she took the chair across from William. Her posture calm but attentive, the kind of quiet strength that did not need to announce itself. What kind of help are you talking about? She asked, her tone polite but careful, not dismissing the offer, but not accepting it blindly either. And William seemed to respect that, nodding slightly as he chose his words. The kind that does not take anything away from him, he said, glancing toward Jaden. Only gives him more room to grow into who he already is. The answer was simple, but it carried intention, and Jaden shifted slightly, his fingers now tracing the edge of the table, still unsure how he had become the center of something so serious. I do not need anything, he said quietly, not out of pride, but honesty. And William's expression softened again, a faint understanding in his eyes. I know, he replied. That is why this matters. And for a moment, the words settled between them, not as pressure, but as recognition. Outside, the sound of a car door closing echoed faintly, followed by low voices. But inside, the focus remained steady. When I was your age, William continued, his voice slower now, more reflective. Someone once told me that the smallest choices define the largest paths. He glanced briefly at the ring, still in his hand. I did not believe it then, he admitted. But I do now. Jaden looked up at him, curiosity beginning to replace uncertainty, and William leaned forward slightly, not imposing, just closer. You made a choice yesterday without knowing who was watching, he said. That is the kind of choice that changes things. Jaden frowned a little, not in disagreement, but in thought. I was not trying to change anything, he said, and William nodded, almost as if that answer confirmed everything. Exactly, he replied, a quiet emphasis in his voice. That is why it did. The room grew still again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more grounded, like something had begun to take shape. Jaden's grandmother reached out and gently picked up the card, turning it in her hand, reading the name and number without reacting outwardly. Though something in her eyes shifted, a recognition of opportunity, but also of responsibility. "If we accept anything," she said slowly, looking back at William, "it has to be something that helps him become more of himself, not less." William met her gaze without hesitation. "That is all I am offering," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no hidden condition, just clarity. Jaden watched them both, the conversation moving around him, but somehow about him in ways he was only beginning to understand, his eyes drifting again to the ring, then back to William. "Why did she give this to me?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the calm with a simple question that carried more weight than it seemed. And for the first time since entering the apartment, William paused completely, the answer not immediate, his fingers tightening slightly around the ring before he slowly placed it back on the table, his expression shifting into something deeper, something more personal. "Because she saw something in you," he said quietly, "the same thing she once saw in me." And in that moment, the distance between their lives seemed to narrow just a little more, not through wealth or power, but through something far more enduring, something neither of them had expected to find in a place like this. The room held its quiet for a few seconds longer, as if everyone inside it was adjusting to a truth that had not been there before, and Jaden looked down at the ring again, this time not as something mysterious, but as something that connected him to a story he had somehow stepped into without knowing, his fingers hovering over it before finally picking it up, feeling its weight more clearly now. "I did not do anything special," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for William to hear. And William gave a small, knowing smile, not dismissing the words, but not agreeing with them either. "That is usually what people who do something special say," he replied gently, and Jaden shook his head slightly, still unsure how to hold that idea, while his grandmother watched him closely, seeing something new forming in the way he carried himself, something steadier, something more aware. "What happens now?" Jaden asked after a moment, his voice simple, but the question carried more than just curiosity. It carried the weight of everything that had just changed, and William took a slow breath before answering, not rushing, not filling the silence with unnecessary promises. "Now," he said, "we make sure this moment does not end here." He gestured lightly toward the ring, toward the card, toward the small apartment that had suddenly become the center of something much larger. "I have spent most of my life building things that grow," he continued. "Companies, systems, investments." His voice calm, reflective, but none of them started the way this did. He looked directly at Jaden. This started with a choice that had no reason behind it except kindness. And that word settled again, deeper this time. Jaden shifted in his seat, the idea still unfamiliar, but no longer uncomfortable. "So what does that mean for me?" he asked, and William did not hesitate this time. "It means you decide what comes next," he said, and that answer seemed to surprise even Jaden, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Me?" he repeated, and William nodded. "Yes," he said, "because whatever I do, whatever I offer, it only matters if it helps you become more of who you already are." The room grew still again, but this time it felt like a pause before movement, not uncertainty. Jaden looked down at his hands, then back at his grandmother, who gave him a small nod, not telling him what to choose, just reminding him that he could. And for a moment, Jaden thought about yesterday, about the hunger, about the cold, about the quiet woman on the bench, and how none of it had felt like a decision at the time, just something that needed to be done. And slowly, he looked back at William. "I do not want to be different," he said carefully, choosing his words as he spoke them. "I just want to be able to help more people like her." And the simplicity of that answer seemed to land harder than anything else. William's expression softening in a way that could not be rehearsed, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Then that is where we begin," he said, his voice steady, but carrying something new, something almost hopeful. And outside, the morning had fully arrived now, sunlight stretching across the street, touching the line of cars, the watching neighbors, the worn edges of the building. But inside, the light felt different, as if it had found something worth staying for. And in that small space, between a boy who gave without thinking and a man who had spent years learning how to receive. Something had shifted that neither of them could undo, and neither of them wanted to. The decision did not arrive with noise or celebration. It settled quietly into the room like something that had always been waiting there, and William nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, as if Jaden had just said the one thing that mattered most. "Then we do it your way," he said, his voice steady, almost certain, and for the first time since he arrived, he stepped back slightly, giving the space room to breathe again, not filling it with his presence, but letting it exist as it was. Jaden glanced at his grandmother again, and she gave him a small smile, the kind that said she trusted him, that whatever came next would still belong to him, not be taken from him. And William reached for the ring one more time before placing it gently back into Jaden's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it with a quiet care. "This stays with you," he said. "It is not payment. It is not a reward. It is a reminder." Jaden looked down at his closed hand, feeling the cool metal press against his palm, and somehow it felt different now, not just something given, but something entrusted. "A reminder of what?" he asked, and William's expression softened again, a faint warmth in his eyes. "Of who you already are when no one is watching," he answered, and those words settled deeper than anything else that had been said, because they did not ask Jaden to change, they asked him to remember. Outside, the quiet tension of the neighborhood had not faded. People still lingered, watching, whispering, trying to understand why something so unusual had come to their street. But inside, none of that seemed to matter anymore. William turned slightly toward the door, then paused, as if remembering something important. "There is one more thing," he said, reaching into his coat again. But this time he did not take out anything physical. Instead, he looked directly at Jaden. "My mother asked me to tell you something," he continued, his voice softer now, more personal than before. "She said she did not feel invisible yesterday." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet weight that filled the room completely. Jaden's breath caught slightly, not because he had expected gratitude, but because he had not realized what his action had meant beyond the moment, and William watched him carefully, seeing that realization take shape. "She said that for the first time in a long time. Someone saw her," he added, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that did not need explanation. Jaden looked down again, his grip tightening just slightly around the ring, and his grandmother reached over, resting her hand over his for a brief second, grounding him in that moment. William stepped back toward the door now, his presence no longer filling the room the same way it had when he arrived, but leaving something behind that could not be measured or counted. "I will not change your life overnight," he said, pausing at the threshold, "but I will stand beside whatever you choose to build." And that promise felt different, not like an offer, but like a commitment that would wait for Jaden to grow into it. And as he opened the door, the light from outside spilled in again, brighter now, clearer, and for a brief second, Jaden stood there holding the ring, the words, and something new he could not yet name, but could already feel. And as William stepped out into the morning, the world outside seemed unchanged, but inside, everything had already begun to move. The door closed softly behind William, but the quiet he left behind did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been placed into the room that could not be seen, but could be felt in every corner. And Jaden stood there for a long moment, his hand still wrapped around the ring, the metal warming slowly against his skin as if it had adjusted to him. His grandmother moved first, stepping toward the window and glancing out at the line of cars, the people still watching, their curiosity not fading, only growing. "Well," she said gently, turning back toward him, "that was not an ordinary morning." And Jaden let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried more confusion than humor. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice quieter now, thoughtful, and he walked back to the table, placing the ring down carefully this time, not like before, not casually, but with intention, as if it now held something he needed to protect. His grandmother sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the table. "How do you feel?" she asked, not rushing him, not filling the silence, just waiting. And Jaden looked at the ring, then at the card, then back at her. "Like something changed," he said slowly. "But I do not know what yet." And she nodded, understanding that feeling more than she needed to explain. Sometimes change does not feel loud, she said. Sometimes it feels like this. She gestured gently around the room. Quiet, but real. Jaden leaned back slightly, letting that settle, his eyes drifting again to the door, to where William had stood just minutes ago. And then something else crossed his mind, something that had not fully formed until now. Do you think I should call him? He asked, glancing at the card, and his grandmother smiled softly, not answering immediately. Do you want to? She asked instead, and Jaden paused, considering that, not thinking about what he might gain, but what it might mean. I think so, he said after a moment. But not for money, he added quickly, and she gave a small nod, proud. Then call him for the right reason, she said, and that seemed to settle it. Jaden reached for the card, holding it between his fingers. The number printed clearly, simple, waiting, and for a second, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but because he understood now that this was not just a call, it was a step, and when he finally picked up the phone and dialed, each tone felt louder than it should have. His grandmother watching quietly beside him, offering nothing but presents, and across the city, in the back seat of one of those black cars now moving through traffic, William's phone lit up, the number unfamiliar, but something in him already knew. He answered without delay, his voice steady but attentive. Hello? And Jaden swallowed once before speaking, his voice clear despite the weight of the moment. Hi. It is Jaden. And there was a brief pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of recognition, and then William responded, softer now, more personal than before. I was hoping you would call. And in that simple exchange, something began to move again, not in the room, not in the street, but in the space between two lives that had only just begun to connect. Jaden held the phone a little tighter as William's voice settled on the other end, calm but carrying a quiet curiosity. And for a moment he did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. I was thinking about what you said, he began slowly, his eyes drifting to the ring on the table, about starting something. There was a brief pause, not awkward, just thoughtful, and William leaned slightly forward in his seat, the city moving past his window. Unnoticed now, and, he asked gently, inviting the rest without pressure. Jaden took a small breath. I do not want to wait until I am older, he said, his voice steady now, more certain than before. There are people here, like her, he added, glancing toward the window where the neighborhood stretched out, familiar and unchanged. They sit outside every day, and most people walk past like they are not even there. His words were simple, but they carried a truth that did not need explanation. And on the other end, William closed his eyes briefly, hearing not just the words, but the meaning behind them. So what do you want to do? He asked, and this time there was no hesitation. I want to make sure they are not invisible, Jaden said, and the sentence landed with a quiet clarity that filled the space between them. William opened his eyes again, something shifting behind them, not surprise, but recognition. That is a powerful place to start, he replied, his voice softer now, more aligned with the boy he was speaking to. What would that look like? Jaden glanced at his grandmother, who listened quietly, offering only a small nod of encouragement, and he continued, maybe food, or just talking to them, he said, or letting them know someone sees them. He paused, then added, like she said, and that connection, that echo of the woman's words, seemed to settle something deeper in William. Then we begin there, he said, no hesitation now, just direction. Not with something big, not with something complicated, just something real. Jaden nodded, even though William could not see it. Okay, he said, and for a second, that was enough. But then William spoke again, his tone shifting slightly, more grounded in action. I will come back this afternoon, he said, not with a plan, but with time. And Jaden felt something in that sentence, something different from what he expected. Time, he repeated, and William gave a small, quiet breath that almost sounded like a smile. Yes, he said, because if this is going to mean something, I need to understand it the way you do. And those words carried a kind of respect that did not need to be explained. Jaden looked at the ring again, then at the door, then back at his grandmother, who smiled just a little wider this time. We will be here, he said, and as the call ended, the room felt different again, not because something had been added, but because something had begun. something that did not belong to one person or the other, but to both of them. And outside, the street looked the same, as it always had. But for Jaden, it no longer felt like just a place to pass through. It felt like a place where something could happen, something small, something real, something that might change more than anyone expected. The rest of the morning moved differently after the call, not faster, not louder, but with a quiet sense of purpose that Jaden could feel in the way he stood, the way he looked out the window, the way he noticed things he had passed by 100 times before without thinking. The man who always sat near the corner store with his hands folded, the woman who leaned against the bus stop bench staring at passing cars. The small details that had once blended into the background now standing out, with a kind of clarity that felt new. And his grandmother watched him as he moved around the apartment, picking up small things, setting them down again, not restless, but thoughtful. "You are already starting, you know," she said gently, and Jaden paused, turning toward her. "Starting what?" he asked, and she smiled softly. "Seeing," she replied, and that word settled into him in a way that felt familiar now, like something he had been doing without realizing it, the ring still resting in his pocket, a quiet reminder against his side. And by the time the afternoon light began to stretch across the street, the sound of engines returned, softer this time, fewer cars, less spectacle, but still enough to draw attention. Jaden stood by the window, watching as one black car pulled up, then another, not a line this time, just a presence. And when the door opened, William stepped out alone, no crowd, no urgency, just a man walking towards something he had chosen to return to. Jaden moved toward the door before the knock came, opening it just as William reached the step, and for a brief second, they both paused, not out of uncertainty, but recognition, like they both understood that this was not just a visit, it was a continuation. "You came back," Jaden said simply, and William gave a small nod. "I said I would," he replied, and there was something lighter in his voice now, less distance, more presence. He stepped inside without hesitation, his gaze moving not around the room, this time, but toward Jaden directly. "Where do we start?" he asked, and the question was not rhetorical, it was real, and Jaden glanced toward the window, then back at him. "Outside," he said, and without another word, he turned, grabbing his worn jacket, his grandmother watching with quiet pride as he moved with a kind of confidence she had not seen before, not louder, not bigger, just clearer. William followed him out, the contrast between them still visible, but no longer dividing, just different. And as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the world around them remained the same cracked pavement, the same passing cars, the same people sitting in the same places, but for the first time, it felt like something was about to happen there, not because of wealth or power, but because someone had decided to notice. And as Jaden walked toward the corner, slowing slightly as he approached the man sitting near the store, he glanced back once at William, not for permission, but for presence. And William gave a small nod, understanding, without needing words. And in that quiet moment, between a boy who had chosen to care and a man who had chosen to follow that lead, something began to unfold that neither of them could fully see yet, but both of them were ready to step into. Jaden slowed as he reached the corner, the man sitting there just as he had been that morning, hands folded, eyes drifting between the ground and the street like he was watching something no one else could see. And for a moment, Jaden simply stood there, not speaking, not rushing, just allowing himself to notice, to really see. And behind him, William stopped a few steps back, not stepping in, not leading, just observing, letting the moment belong to Jaden. "Hi," Jaden said finally, his voice calm but clear, and the man looked up slowly, surprised not by the greeting, but by the fact that it was directed at him. "Hi," he replied, his voice quiet, cautious, and Jaden shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket, not for money, not for anything large, just a small wrapped snack his grandmother had given him before he left. "I thought you might want this," he said, holding it out, not as charity, but as an offering. And the man hesitated, his eyes moving from the food to Jaden's face, searching, unsure. "Why?" he asked, not unkindly, just honestly. And Jaden shrugged slightly, a small, familiar gesture. "Because you are here," he said, and that answer seemed to land differently, the man's expression softening just a little as he reached out and accepted it. "Thank you," he said quietly, And for a moment, that was all. No grand reaction, no spectacle, just a simple exchange. But something about it felt steady, real, and Jaden stayed there, not walking away immediately. "What is your name?" he asked, and the man blinked slightly as if that question had not been asked in a long time. "Thomas," he replied, his voice a little firmer now, and Jaden nodded. "I am Jaden," he said, and behind him, William watched the interaction unfold, something shifting in the way he stood, not as a man observing a situation, but as someone learning from it, understanding that this was not about solving, not about fixing, but about acknowledging. And as Jaden sat down on the edge of the curb beside Thomas, the space between them no longer felt like distance, it felt like connection, simple, quiet. And William stepped a little closer, not interrupting, just joining the edge of that moment, his presence less defined now by status and more by intention. "Good afternoon," he said to Thomas, his voice respectful, even, and Thomas looked at him, noticing the difference immediately, the clothes, the posture, but also something else, something less expected. "Afternoon," he replied, and there was no tension, no discomfort, just a shared space that had been created without force. Jaden glanced between them, then back at the street. "There are more people like him," he said softly, not pointing, not labeling, just stating a truth, and William followed his gaze, seeing what he had passed by before without stopping. People sitting, standing, waiting, existing in plain sight, but rarely acknowledged, and for the first time, he did not see them as a problem to solve, but as individuals to meet. "Then we meet them," he said quietly. And the words were not a strategy, they were a shift, and as the three of them sat there, the afternoon moving slowly around them, something subtle but powerful began to take root, not in a boardroom, not in a plan, but on a sidewalk, where a boy chose to see, a man chose to learn, and another man was no longer invisible. The afternoon stretched on, but something about it no longer felt ordinary, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something quiet had finally been seen. And as Jaden sat there beside Thomas, listening more than speaking, asking small questions, sharing simple words, the space between strangers began to dissolve into something warmer, something human, and William remained just close enough to witness it without interrupting it, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his attention fully present in a way that no meeting or negotiation had ever required of him before. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, more people passed, some glancing briefly, some slowing, some even stopping, not because they were told to, but because something about the scene felt different. A boy sitting without judgment, a man listening without distance, another man learning without control, and in that quiet triangle, something began to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. Jaden reached into his pocket again, pulling out the ring for a moment, turning it gently between his fingers as he looked at it, then at Thomas, then at William, and for the first time, he understood what it meant, not just as a memory, but as a direction. "We can do this every day," he said softly, not asking, not suggesting, just stating what felt true, and William looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just a boy, but a beginning. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper now. "We can," and Thomas nodded slightly, not fully understanding the scale of what might come, but understanding enough to feel included. And as the lights softened into evening, Jaden stood slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans, not to end the moment, but to carry it forward. "I will come back tomorrow," he said to Thomas, and the promise was simple, but it held weight, because it was real. And Thomas gave a small smile, the kind that had been absent before. "I will be here," he replied, and for a second, that was all that mattered. William stepped forward then, not to lead, but to stand beside Jaden, his presence no longer separate from the moment, but part of it. And as they began to walk back down the sidewalk together, the city moved around them just as it always had, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone. Jaden glanced up at William. "It is not about being rich, is it?" he asked, and William paused slightly, considering the question before answering. "No," he said quietly. "It never was." And that answer settled into the space between them, simple, clear, and true. And as they reached the building, the worn steps, the familiar door, the place where everything had started that morning. Jaden held the ring a little tighter, not because he needed to, but because he understood it now, not as something he was given, but as something he would carry forward. And inside, his grandmother waited, the light from the small lamp casting a warm glow across the room. And when he stepped in, nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because the world outside had not become different, but Jaden had learned how to see it. And in that quiet understanding, a boy who once gave away his only meal had unknowingly started something far greater, not with money, not with power, but with a choice, and that choice, simple as it was, had begun to change not just one life, but many, one moment at a time.